certain kinds of archetypes persistent in the data for a long period of time. Basically, the longer that they're there, the more meaningful the event will be when it finally arrives. And as an instance, we had this long period of time that we had this city being driven back to the mud from which it was built, this weird kind of an archetype that eventually fleshed itself out to a description of what was going to happen to New Orleans in the Katrina instance. In the main, I mean, we're not talking detail levels, but we got that fairly well. We had the diaspora there, and that was out a long time, and I actually think that was where George developed his postulate around that particular event anyway.
The one that scares me, George, is that we have been looking at death of the dollar, gosh, what is it, 3 or 4 years now, Cliff, in the data set?
All the way back to 2003, George.
Yeah. So that's what scares me personally, because my whole website and my area of focus is long wave economics, and when we see something coming that far in advance and have these way off the chart numbers for 2010, 2011 for gold and silver prices, and talk about hyperinflation. We can get into this later, of course. But when we see something that's been in model space for 6, 7 years coming down the pike, and then we hit October of 2008 bang on, we've got some dates coming up that are just unsettling at best.
Hence, that's the reason, I guess, the shape of things to come, Cliff, in your work here, you say weak and harder mind, don't read further, huh?
Yeah, I really don't want to pollute people's consciousness with this. If they're, for me, as a personal level, I won't ever watch a slasher film or a horror film because I just don't want those images in my head. And so I'm just giving people a chance to basically make a decision. And there are a number of people that read the disclaimer and then they ask for a refund, and that's fine with me. I have no problem with that because, better they should manage their own consciousness than allow me to intrude with these rather nasty imagery.
If more than several people were involved in 9/11, beyond the terrorists and those who put it together, let's say it was a little wider, but they did not go on the Internet and obviously chat about it, would your software somehow still be able to pick up on it, on other things? I mean, maybe they told some other people.
It doesn't quite work that way.
Okay.
Because we don't pick up consciousness.
It's not like the Princeton Egg projects.
Correct. And it's not like what NSA or the CIA do or Echelon or any of these other guys who actually care who says what to whom.
This is hard data.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's looking at the telescope or the microscope. We tend to get the very broad view very correct, and Admiral Poindexter's folks like to drill down and find out what size socks does George Noory wear. That kind of detail.
Or does he even wear socks?
Uh-oh.
Right? Of course he does. Of course he does. We're going to talk a lot about the future when we get back into all of this. This is fascinating work. Cliff, once you got into it, did it shock you?
I was doomed. There was no question. In '97, I made some discoveries that I thought I was on this path to being able to sell the software to fools like George Ure who care about what the stock market does. And then I started seeing this other stuff, and I thought, no, wait a second. None of this makes sense relative to what I told my software to go do. And I was doomed from that point on. And yes, it is extremely disturbing, and it's rough to maintain an even strain, so to speak, on your mental attitude when you're swimming in the extreme level of language that I see here.
Well, I've been a believer in precious metals for some time, but after reading The Shape of Things to Come, I'm now convinced that that's going to be a huge investment for people in the future.
It is and it isn't. I mean, it is, but it's going to be a horrific time surrounding that.
Yeah.
So
you have to know the times to pop in and out, I guess, huh?
I'm not in for timing. I'm saying that the purchase of precious metals it's a different kind of a concept than, quote, making money. We're beyond the point. Actually, our data for a couple of years now has pointed to the idea that we're shading over into what we're calling a calorie economy, and that we're now beyond the idea that money can make money on its own. Because what's actually going to occur is that the base level of our economic unit in the future, and I'm talking maybe 5 or 6 years from now, will be the calorie, excess food. And from there on, everything depends on that.
Let's get into some of the forecasting when we come back, George and Cliff, on Coast to Coast AM. And now we're going to get into the good stuff with George Ure and Cliff High as we talk about some of their forecasting with the WebBot technology. That's all next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George and Cliff, you had been forecasting a global coastal event this year in the tides seem to be going up. What's going on in this arena?
Well, George can take that. He's been sort of tracking a bit of it.
All right.
Yeah, there has been an announcement placed on the NOAA Tides and Currents website, and it came right on schedule, by the way. We had been expecting that we'd have a prequel event, and that happened in March of this year when a group meeting in Scandinavia, a scientific group, talked about the risk of oceans rising over the next 100 years or so. But we were looking for something much more dramatic and much more apparent. And so starting during the month of June, NOAA reports that tides on the east coast of the U.S. were running anywhere from 0.6 of a foot to 2 feet above normal. And in the first couple of weeks of July, it had backed off a bit, up only 0.3 of a foot to a foot. But nevertheless, when you start doing the calculations on how many trillions of gallons of water that is, it's a very odd, very strange phenomenon to take place right on schedule. And we haven't seen any explanations yet as for why it's happening. Occasionally you'll, of course, see offshore storms provide some change. You know, a low pressure or high pressure system offshore can give you some variance in sea level, and that in turn ripples through to tides. Poor puns intended.
Yeah.
Sorry. But what we don't know is if this is limited to 2,000 miles of East Coast, or whether foreign stations that measure tides over long periods of time will start showing the same things. And it comes concurrent with a volcano trying to pop off in the Philippines, and also in the linguistics, there's an expectation of new lands arising off of Clif, South America?
Actually, Indian Ocean should be the largest. But remember, we had the large volcano off Tonga that is now created a new island, as well as that giant upthrust event in Alaska, giant by anybody's criteria, of 20 feet. And then there's that big brown blob.
Oh, and also we had the 7.8 earthquake off of the South Island of New Zealand. So
correct, yeah.
Definitely we're starting to get some planetary movement. And really the question about this global coastal phenomena is it going to be a single event, or is it going to be a stew of events? We have had in the past occasional archetypes come along that are indicative of a sequence of events that group under a single kind of an archetype. And that's what this appears to be.
You know, there's a volcano in the Canary Islands.
Sure.
Near La Palma. And
Cumbre Viejo.
Yeah, if that goes, they predict a massive tsunami on the eastern coast of the U.S.
Yeah, that's the one which essentially washes over Florida, swamps Washington, D.C., takes out the New York Stock Exchange, and up in the hills could wash, some reports say 1,000 feet, although there are some physics limits on how big the wave could run up. It would nevertheless be devastating to tens of millions of people.
When you see coastal events, is this something you're seeing or not?
Not specifically that instance, but large intrusions into coastal life, very definitely, on any number of fronts from any number of coastal-related criteria. So, for instance, we had initially started with a global coastal event, and then it kept getting broader, and so we called it the global coastal phenomena. And in the West Coast here, we're in the fourth year now of no oyster spawn, so from the native oysters. So we're getting all different kinds of bioreactive aspects of it. And then the sea level rise we're seeing is not catastrophic in the form of a giant tsunami. And I'm of the camp that says, regardless of the amount of pressure, all you can do is get about 180 meters maximum. Still a huge wave, but you can't get 1,000 feet just simply because of the physics. But nonetheless, the intrusions are seen as being a little bit more gradual. Bear in mind that our descriptors actually showed this whole thing as a period of about 5 months, that we'd be discussing this as humans kind of got used to the idea that things are unusual on the coast. Didn't mean that it was going to stop. Our data then goes on to suggest that it's going to grow over time with a larger peak in about March or April of 2011, I think, and then it'll sort of plateau for a while from there. And it's going to get rather disturbing for a lot of people.
There's also in the very, very long-term values, Cliff, the mention of the moon moving about and some other things like that.
Yeah, correct. There is some suggestion, and we're seeing some of it now as well, associated with this in the same entity, which is the Terra entity, which is the area that we model all of the things related to the planet itself, are such things as magnetic disturbances, both internal to the planet as well as within the magnetosphere. And I'm actually of the opinion that we could get a combination of those that would account for large-scale shifts in water that don't necessarily, they're not really even tidal waves or tsunamis, but rather something different. And the theory would be that we'd have a magnetic anomaly of a sufficient size, and here the other day NASA reports that we've got a magnetic hole, or a hole in the magnetosphere that's 3 times the size of the planet. And imagine that the moon gets over that hole. Well, the gravity effect of the moon over that hole is going to be different than when it's around other areas that are shielded by the magnetosphere. So even something as small as that little slight difference in the moon track could cause rather erratic coastal conditions relative to waves and so forth. And they may well settle down when the moon goes back. Just no way of knowing. But we'll be discussing it for a number of months as it unfolds.
I have had people, Cliff and George, talk on this program over the past 6 months, talking about something impending. They feel something strange. It's weird. They can't put their finger on it, but they just sense something. Are you picking up anything?
Yeah, boy, that's a sure loaded question.
Yeah.
Yes, we are. Really, the question is, what level of detail and what area of this giant thing do you want to examine?
I mean, is it all fronts? We'll talk about the economy. We'll talk about Iran. We'll talk about North Korea tonight and all these other aspects. But this is something, I think it's bigger. It's affecting people's ability to react with other people. It's depressing people.
This is also part of what we're calling the big squeeze. I'm sorry. That kind of eluded my thinking there for a second, but it's our supposition from something that was in the data way back when, and I want to say 1998 I first noticed it relative to the sun, that basically what's going on is our solar system is wobbling up and down around the thin edge of the Milky Way where there's a higher concentration of magnetics. Or as the Russians would have us understand it, we're into an area of more energetic space. There's a lot more energy there. And such philosophers as Gurdjieff and others have called it the soli lunis, and it does indeed affect us all. And what we have to do is to watch out that it doesn't affect us all into a world war, because we'll be going crazy just and reacting to circumstances without really being aware that our reactions themselves are not what would be considered normal because of this big magnetic squeeze that's going on.
See, I've seen a lot of road rage, but I'm seeing more of it. I've seen a lot of rude people. I've seen more rude people. It's just strange. I can't put my finger on it.
If you step back from it, George, and think of it as waves of energy that become more extreme and more tightly compressed. I think Art used to refer to it as the quickening.
Yes.
What we're seeing now is we're seeing more intense waves closer and closer together until the amount of change in the data for Cliff, the first 3 months of next year.
Oh yeah, correct.
That will represent the same amount of emotional release as, say, the preceding 7 or 8 years. And then we're going to get into 3 months later, we'll be going through a compression where we'll see everything from 1999 emotionally through that big change in early 2010 occurring over a 2 or 3 month period of emotional impact. And that's going to literally make people nuts.
And let me just be real clear about this so that everybody understands. Our data seems to confirm the theories that are expressed by Terence McKenna as well as Mr. Kalaman and Mr. Lungold in their own ways, because we do appear to see, as George puts it, waves of increasing pressure. And as the wave passes, you get into kind of a stabilized equilibrium for a brief period of time, and then this is what we're calling our building emotional tension and release of emotional tension periods.